Ilhan Omar was seated among other officials inside a large conference hall where delegates from across the world had gathered. The hall was beautifully decorated, with long rows of flags from different nations, polished wooden tables, and microphones set up for speakers. It was one of those events where leaders and representatives came together to share ideas, defend their people, and present visions for the future. The atmosphere was serious, yet hopeful, because this was not just about politics. It was about identity, resources, justice, and the dignity of entire nations. When the name of Ibrahim Traore was announced, people leaned forward in curiosity. Many had heard about him, the young captain from Burkina Faso who had risen to power with strong ideas about freedom and independence. Some admired him, while others doubted him, thinking he was too young, too bold, or too determined to stand against the old systems. Still, the moment was important. He was walking into a room filled with experienced politicians, some of whom had been in power for decades. Traore stepped forward with quiet confidence. He wore his military-style uniform, neat and pressed, with the national colors visible. He carried himself with a calm but firm presence, his eyes sharp yet humble. For many watching, it was refreshing to see someone so young but so determined to speak for his people. He adjusted the microphone, greeted the audience politely, and began his speech in a steady voice. As he started, however, a sound came from the corner of the hall. It was Ilhan Omar, a U.S. congresswoman known for her outspoken opinions. She was laughing. At first, people thought it might be a small chuckle at something unrelated. But as Traore spoke with seriousness about the struggles of his people, Omar's laughter grew louder. She leaned back in her chair, covered her mouth slightly, but continued laughing as if the young leader's words were amusing. The hall grew tense. Delegates looked at each other in confusion. Some frowned, others whispered. Cameras turned quickly, capturing both Traore's speech and Omar's reaction. 5 minutes is not a short time in such a setting, and during those minutes, Omar's laughter echoed more than once. For Traore, standing at the podium, it was a test. He could clearly see her reaction, but he did not break his flow. Instead, he continued, his voice calm, his tone unwavering. He spoke about Burkina Faso's long history of hardship. He described how the country's resources had been taken by outsiders for years, how his people had worked hard yet remained poor, and how his generation wanted to change that story. He talked about dignity, about standing tall even when mocked, and about refusing to be treated as less than others simply because they were from a small African nation. His words were strong, but his delivery was gentle. He did not shout, nor did he show anger. He kept his focus as if the laughter was only background noise. Those watching could not ignore the difference between the two figures. On one side was Omar, laughing during a moment of seriousness, and on the other side was Traore, steady, respectful, and determined. The contrast was powerful. People in the hall began to shift their attention more and more toward him, drawn by his composure. The more he spoke, the more his words carried weight, while her laughter seemed more out of place. Inside, though, many wondered what Traore was thinking. Did he feel insulted? Was he ignoring it completely, or was he waiting for the right moment to respond? Only he knew. But his face showed no anger. Instead, it showed discipline, the kind that comes from believing in something bigger than pride. The cameras captured everything, and within moments, media outlets began streaming the scene online. The image was unforgettable, a young African leader speaking passionately about his people, while a well-known politician from the West laughed for minutes on end. Social media exploded with comments. Some defended Omar, saying maybe she misunderstood. Others criticized her strongly, saying her behavior showed arrogance. But almost everyone praised Traore's calmness, because staying composed under such circumstances is not easy. As the 5 minutes dragged on, the atmosphere in the hall became heavier. Even those who might not have agreed with Traore began to respect his ability to continue without being shaken. Every word he spoke seemed to grow stronger in meaning, not weaker, because of the laughter that tried to overshadow him. It was as if the attempt to belittle him only gave him a larger stage. When he described how Burkina Faso's farmers worked the land but never received fair rewards, the audience listened closely. When he spoke about children needing education, not charity, they nodded. And when he said that dignity could not be begged but must be defended, applause began to rise from sections of the room. Omar's laughter, once noticeable, now seemed uncomfortable. The more people paid attention to Traore, the less they were amused by her behavior. It was no longer just about a man giving a speech, it was about respect, values, and the way leaders treat each other. By the time Traore finished that portion of his remarks, the hall was filled with quiet respect for him, while Omar's reaction had become a shadow hanging over her. But Traore himself did not rush. He spoke as if he had all the time in the world. His calmness was his shield. While others might have snapped back immediately or shown anger, he chose patience. It was the kind of patience that carries power. He knew that his true response would come at the right moment, and that moment was not during her laughter. It would come later, when the entire hall was listening, when her laughter could no longer hide behind noise. Those 5 minutes, though awkward, became unforgettable. They set the stage for what would follow, because in those minutes the world saw two sides, one of mockery, and one of dignity. That image would be remembered far longer than the actual length of her laughter. And though Omar might not have realized it then, the cameras had captured something that would change how people saw her, not just in that hall, but across the globe. When Traore finally paused to sip water and continued his speech, many in the room already knew that the story of the day would not be about policy papers or diplomatic agreements. It would be about the young African leader who faced open laughter yet refused to be shaken. It would be about how one person's calmness made another's mockery look small. And it would be about how the dignity of a leader could turn even a humiliating moment into a stage of respect. When Ibrahim Traore finished the first part of his speech, the hall was quiet. Everyone could feel the weight of his words. But there was still a question in many people's minds: how would he respond to the laughter that had filled the air only minutes ago? He had ignored it while speaking, showing remarkable patience. Yet people wondered whether he would address it directly or simply move on. That moment arrived soon enough, and what followed surprised everyone. Traore looked up from his notes, lifted his eyes slowly, and fixed his gaze in the direction where Ilhan Omar was seated. The hall became still again, as if every delegate knew something important was about to happen. His voice remained steady, not sharp or angry, but firm enough to carry across the room. He said that in moments of seriousness, the true character of leaders is revealed. Some respond with dignity, others with silence, and some with laughter. He paused there, letting the words sink in. The pause itself was powerful, almost louder than his voice, because the entire audience knew who he was referring to. Omar shifted slightly in her chair. A smile lingered on her face, but the confidence behind it seemed to fade. The cameras caught every movement, and the people watching the broadcast could sense that she had not expected him to address her so directly. Traore, however, did not speak with bitterness. Instead, he used her reaction as an example to make a larger point. He explained that his people had lived through decades of humiliation. Outsiders had taken their resources, treated them as weak, and laughed at their attempts to stand tall. The mocking sound of laughter was not new to them. He said his people knew what it was like to be seen as small, to have their struggles dismissed as unimportant, and to be treated as though their voices did not matter. Yet, he added, every time they were laughed at, they became stronger. Every insult was fuel for their determination to rise. The hall was silent, but not cold. It was the kind of silence where people leaned forward, listening carefully, afraid to miss even one word. Delegates who had earlier looked uncomfortable now seemed proud to be witnessing such a moment. He was not simply giving a speech, he was teaching a lesson in dignity. Traore then turned slightly and addressed the room as a whole. He said that mockery is easy, but building a nation is hard. He reminded everyone that the people of Burkina Faso worked the land under the hot sun, that mothers carried water for miles, and that children studied under dim lights because they believed in a better tomorrow. He asked the audience whether those people deserved laughter or respect. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but everyone already knew the truth. At that moment, a few delegates began to clap softly. It was not the usual polite applause that follows any statement, it was a natural, emotional reaction to his words. Soon, the clapping grew louder. People from different countries, different cultures, stood in support of him. Omar, seated in the same spot, now looked visibly uncomfortable. The cameras showed her face, and social media users later replayed those seconds again and again, comparing her earlier laughter with the applause that now filled the hall. But Traore did not stop there. He wanted the lesson to be clear. He spoke about history, about how many African leaders in the past had been mocked before they became symbols of freedom. He mentioned names of revolutionaries who were laughed at when they first spoke of independence, yet those very voices later inspired entire continents. He said that arrogance has always been the weapon of those who fear change. And then he looked straight ahead and said that no amount of laughter could erase the truth of justice. The words cut through the room like a blade of clarity. The contrast was impossible to miss. A few minutes of laughter had now been turned into a mirror, reflecting the difference between arrogance and dignity. People could see it clearly. And as much as Omar might have wished to fade into the background, the spotlight stayed fixed on her, not because she was speaking, but because her silence after his words was louder than her laughter before them. Outside the hall, the world was watching too. The video clip spread quickly. News outlets reported it in real time, headlines flashing across screens: young African leader responds to mockery with powerful words. Millions of viewers saw the side-by-side images: on one screen Omar laughing, on the other Traore speaking with unshakable calm. The difference was striking. Back inside the hall, Traore continued with grace. He thanked those who listened, saying that the respect of even one person meant more to him than the laughter of many. He reminded the audience that he was not there to please anyone, but to represent his people, who had sent him with a mission. His voice grew stronger, not louder, but filled with the kind of strength that comes from deep conviction. He said that the people of Burkina Faso were tired of being told they were too small, too weak, or too dependent. They were ready to stand on their own, even if it meant facing ridicule. This struck a chord with many leaders in the room who came from nations with similar struggles. Delegates from smaller countries nodded in agreement, understanding every word he said. To them, it was not just Burkina Faso's story, it was their story too. And so, the applause grew again, this time louder and more sustained. The sound filled the hall, echoing across walls that had heard many speeches before, but rarely one that carried such honesty. Omar now sat silently, her earlier confidence gone. Her laughter, once carefree, had become the subject of global discussion. She knew the cameras were on her, and that every second of her reaction would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered. But there was little she could do at that moment. The more she tried to appear calm, the more the contrast stood out. For Traore, however, it was not about personal revenge. He did not attack her name or insult her directly. Instead, he lifted the entire discussion to a higher level, turning what could have been a personal insult into a universal lesson about respect. He showed the world that true leadership is not measured by how loud one laughs, but by how firmly one stands when being laughed at. By the time he finished, the atmosphere of the hall had completely shifted. What had begun as an awkward moment had become a turning point. Delegates looked at him with new respect, journalists rushed to capture his words, and even those who had doubted him earlier now admitted that he had handled the situation with rare maturity. As Traore left the podium, people stood up to shake his hand. They wanted to be associated with his strength, his calmness, and his vision. The young leader from Burkina Faso had not only defended himself but had turned mockery into a victory. The laughter that was supposed to weaken him had instead strengthened his voice across the world. That day, people realized something important: dignity is louder than laughter, and respect is more lasting than ridicule. Traore had shown that the true test of a leader is not in avoiding challenges, but in transforming them into moments of triumph. And though the hall would host many more speeches in the future, that moment between Ilhan Omar and Ibrahim Traore would remain one of the most unforgettable. When Ibrahim Traore finished his response inside the conference hall, the audience was already impressed. But what no one fully realized at that moment was how quickly the entire world would come to know about it. Within minutes, clips of the event were uploaded to social media platforms by journalists and delegates in the room. Some had filmed the whole scene live, while others captured shorter segments that focused only on the most dramatic contrast: Ilhan Omar laughing, and then Traore calmly responding with dignity. These videos spread faster than anyone expected, reaching millions of people in just a few hours. The internet gave the story wings. On Twitter, hashtags began trending in several countries. Words like dignity, respect, and mockery filled timelines. Memes appeared almost instantly, some comparing Omar's laughter with Traore's calm face, others writing captions like "This is leadership" under his photo. Facebook groups in Africa shared the clips with pride, calling him the voice of a new generation of African leadership. On YouTube, entire channels uploaded reaction videos, with commentators from around the world analyzing what had just happened. The most powerful moment of the clip, people said, was not Omar's laughter but the way Traore ignored it until the right moment. Instead of reacting immediately, he continued his speech with calm authority, and then addressed the issue in a way that lifted the conversation above personal insult. Viewers admired how he turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson that spoke to millions. They said his composure showed true strength, the kind that does not need shouting or anger to prove its power. In Burkina Faso, crowds gathered in cafes, homes, and public squares to watch the video. The people cheered loudly whenever Traore appeared on screen. For them, it was not only about their leader winning an argument, it was about their nation being seen and respected on the world stage. For years, they had felt ignored or belittled, but now the eyes of the world were on their captain, and he had represented them with honor. Many described it as a moment of national pride that would be remembered for decades. Meanwhile, in the United States, the reaction was very different for Ilhan Omar. News outlets replayed the clip with critical commentary. Some analysts said her behavior was unprofessional, while others said it revealed arrogance toward African leadership. Even newspapers that were usually supportive of her questioned why she chose to laugh during such a serious moment. Talk shows picked it up as a topic of debate, with guests asking whether leaders should show more respect, no matter their personal views. Omar herself did not immediately respond. Her office released a short statement saying the moment had been taken out of context. But the problem was that the video was clear and needed no explanation. The world had seen it as it happened. Social media users continued to share the clip, and every attempt to explain only seemed to bring more attention to the story. Critics said that in politics, perception often mattered as much as intention, and in this case, the perception was already fixed. Back in Africa, other leaders also joined the discussion. Presidents, ministers, and ambassadors from different countries praised Traore publicly, saying his calmness showed maturity beyond his years. Some even said the event was proof that Africa no longer needed to beg for respect but could command it through dignity and truth. Articles in African newspapers called him the leader who turned laughter into silence and the captain who taught the world a lesson. For the younger generation across the continent, the moment became a symbol of hope. University students in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Senegal organized discussions about the speech. Many said they admired how Traore showed that being young was not a weakness, but a chance to bring new energy and courage. They compared his calm response to the fiery speeches of older leaders from history, saying he was continuing their legacy but in a modern way. The scene even inspired artwork. Painters, digital artists, and cartoonists began creating posters and illustrations of Traore standing tall at the podium while laughter echoed around him. These images circulated widely, becoming part of the global conversation. Musicians added his words into their songs, creating rap verses and spoken word performances that celebrated the dignity of staying calm under pressure. Omar, on the other hand, faced increasing pressure at home. While some supporters defended her, saying the story was being exaggerated, the overwhelming narrative was against her. Political opponents used the moment to question her credibility. Community leaders in her own district expressed disappointment, saying respect should be shown to all voices, especially those speaking on behalf of entire nations. Editorials in newspapers described the incident as a turning point that damaged her image beyond repair. But the real difference between the two figures was not only in public perception, it was in the way they carried themselves afterward. Traore did not mention the incident again directly. He allowed his words to stand for themselves. He traveled back to Burkina Faso and continued his work, focusing on issues like agriculture, education, and resource independence. Reporters asked him questions about the laughter, but he simply smiled and said that the dignity of his people was always more important than mockery. This response made people admire him even more, because it showed that he was not chasing personal victory, but national respect. Omar, however, struggled to escape the story. Wherever she went, reporters asked about the incident. Every time she spoke on a new topic, people brought it back to the 5 minutes of laughter. It became like a shadow following her, a single moment that kept undoing all her efforts to move forward. In politics, reputations are fragile, and once an image is set in the public mind, it is hard to erase. For her, that image was no longer of a serious leader, but of someone laughing at dignity. Weeks later, international conferences still mentioned the event. Delegates said the lesson was clear: respect should be the foundation of diplomacy. Leaders might disagree, but they must never dismiss the struggles of others as a joke. Scholars wrote articles about it, calling it the laughter that backfired and the speech that changed the narrative. Some even suggested that future leaders should study the clip as an example of how to handle disrespect with composure. In Burkina Faso, Traore's popularity soared even higher. Children in schools were shown the video as a lesson in courage and self-control. Teachers told their students that true strength is not shown by mocking others, but by standing tall when mocked. Farmers in villages who had never paid attention to global conferences before now spoke proudly of their captain, saying he had made the whole world listen to them. The world had indeed listened, and it was clear that Omar's laughter had given Traore a bigger stage than he could have asked for. Without intending to, she had made him the center of global attention, and he had used that attention to deliver a message that resonated far beyond the walls of the conference hall. What was meant as a moment of ridicule turned into a defining moment of respect. In the end, part 3 of this story was not only about what happened in the hall, but what happened afterward. The laughter did not last, but the lesson did. Traore's words continued to echo across continents, reminding the world that dignity cannot be destroyed by mockery. Instead, it is strengthened by it. And while Omar faced the consequences of those 5 minutes, Traore carried forward the respect he had earned, showing that leadership is not about age, power, or titles, but about the ability to turn even the harshest moments into victories of respect. The days after the conference were stormy for Ilhan Omar. What she had thought was a small moment inside a hall turned into a wave that shook her entire career. At first, she did not realize how serious it was. She believed the story would disappear in a day or two, like so many political stories do. But this one was different. The video clip of her laughing at Ibrahim Traore had already reached millions of people around the world, and more people were sharing it every hour. Once a moment is captured on camera, it cannot be erased, and soon the story became larger than she could control. In the United States, television programs played the clip repeatedly. News anchors raised their eyebrows as they showed Omar laughing while Traore spoke about the struggles of his people. Commentators asked simple but sharp questions: why was she laughing? Did she think the suffering of Burkina Faso was funny? Did she feel so secure in her own position that she could mock another leader so openly? These questions echoed in living rooms across the country. Voters who had once supported her now began to hesitate, unsure of how to defend her behavior. On social media, the criticism was even sharper. People from different backgrounds, not only Africans, wrote posts saying that laughter in such a serious setting showed arrogance. Even some of her own followers said they were disappointed. Hashtags against her trend, while hashtags praising Traore rose higher. Videos comparing her reaction with his calm response gained millions of views. For Omar, it felt as though the internet had turned against her overnight. In her district, community leaders who once invited her warmly now began to distance themselves. Some said they respected her past work but could not support her after this. Others said that if she could laugh at a leader defending his people, how could she be trusted to represent her own? The criticism was not only about the event itself, it was about what it symbolized. People believed it revealed something about her character, and in politics, perception can be as powerful as truth. At the same time, Ibrahim Traore's image grew brighter. Newspapers in Europe and Asia wrote about him as the young leader who had turned mockery into a moment of dignity. Political scholars called it a case study in leadership. They said the real lesson was not about Omar but about Traore's ability to stay calm under pressure. His refusal to lose control gave him more respect than any loud argument could have. The story spread to classrooms and universities, where students discussed the meaning of respect, dignity, and leadership in modern times. Traore himself did not speak much about the incident. When journalists asked him directly, he smiled politely and said he came to the conference for his people, not for personal battles. He explained that the real issue was independence for Burkina Faso, not who laughed or who did not. This only made people admire him more. While Omar appeared to be explaining and defending herself constantly, Traore rose above the noise and focused on his mission. Back in America, Omar's opponents used the moment to weaken her. During debates, they brought up the video and asked whether a leader who mocked others deserved respect herself. Campaign advertisements replayed the clip to remind voters of the laughter. Her career, once strong, now felt fragile. She still had supporters, but the balance had shifted. For every person defending her, there were 10 sharing the video and shaking their heads in disappointment. Some of Omar's friends and colleagues advised her to apologize openly. They said that humility might soften the anger. But she hesitated, worried that an apology would be seen as weakness. She released careful statements saying that the clip was misunderstood, that she was reacting to something else. But no matter what she said, the image of her laughter remained stronger than her words. People did not believe the excuses. They trusted their own eyes. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traore became a national hero. Posters of him were painted on walls. Musicians wrote songs praising his courage. Teachers told their students about the day he turned laughter into silence. Even elders in villages far away from the capital spoke proudly of their young captain. For them, it was not only about him, it was about themselves. When he stood tall, they felt they stood tall too. The entire nation carried his dignity as their own. Across Africa, leaders who had once doubted him now welcomed him warmly. They invited him to regional meetings, praised him in public, and even quoted his words. For decades, Africa had struggled with the image of being ignored or belittled on the global stage. Traore had shown that respect could be won not with anger but with composure. He had given hope not only to Burkina Faso but to all nations that wanted to be treated with equality. The difference between the two figures grew wider each day. Omar faced more questions, more criticism, and more loss of trust. Traore faced more admiration, more invitations, and more opportunities. What began as a 5-minute laugh had become a long-lasting turning point. People said it was like watching two roads diverge, one leading downward into regret, the other upward into respect. By the end of the month, Omar noticed the change even in her daily life. When she appeared at events, people looked at her differently. Some whispered, others recorded her with their phones, waiting to catch another moment that might go viral. She had lost the sense of control she once had over her public image. In contrast, Traore's face was everywhere on television, in newspapers, and on social media, celebrated as a symbol of dignity. Even in the halls of power in Washington, her colleagues treated her differently. Some avoided standing too close when cameras were around, worried that association might harm them. Others privately told her that she needed to rebuild her image, but no one could offer a clear solution. The damage was already deep. Once trust is lost, it is hard to recover. For Traore, the future looked bright. He continued his work in Burkina Faso, focusing on reforms, education, and unity. His calm response at the conference became part of his leadership style, a tool that strengthened his voice at every new meeting. People listened more carefully to him now, not because of his age or his uniform, but because he had proven himself in the face of disrespect. He had shown that leadership is not about shouting louder, but about standing taller. In the end, the contrast could not be clearer. Omar's career faced its hardest test, while Traore's career rose to new heights. The world had watched them both in the same moment, and the judgment had been made not by words alone, but by actions. Laughter had tried to weaken a leader, but instead it weakened the one who laughed. Dignity had seemed quiet, but it spoke louder than any voice in the room. That was the lesson everyone remembered: respect lasts, arrogance fades. For Ilhan Omar, the 5 minutes of laughter became a long shadow over her career. For Ibrahim Traore, those same 5 minutes became the foundation of his global respect. And though time would move on and new stories would take the headlines, people knew they had witnessed something unforgettable, something that revealed the true nature of leadership in the modern world. Weeks passed, but the story did not fade away. Instead, it grew stronger, like a tree whose roots dig deeper with time. Everywhere Ilhan Omar went, the memory of her laughter followed her. And everywhere Ibrahim Traore went, the memory of his calm response lifted him higher. What was once a short 5-minute moment had now become a symbol that people around the world carried with them. It was no longer just about one laugh or one speech, it was about what those actions represented. For Omar, the struggle to recover became heavier with each day. She tried to focus on her usual work, attending events, meeting with community leaders, and giving speeches. But at every step, there were whispers and side glances. Reporters asked her questions she did not want to hear. Do you regret your reaction at the conference? What do you think about the backlash? Even when she tried to talk about new topics, people brought the discussion back to that single clip. It became impossible for her to escape it. She released more statements, carefully written by her team, explaining that her laughter had been misunderstood. She said she respected all leaders, including Ibrahim Traore, and that she never intended to insult anyone. But the problem was not the intention, it was the image. People had seen her laughter, and they had seen Traore's dignity. That image was already burned into their minds. No statement could erase it. For many voters and observers, the damage was permanent. Her opponents used it as a weapon. During public debates, they replayed the clip on big screens. They told the audience that this was not the behavior of someone who respected global voices. They argued that she had embarrassed not only herself but her position as a representative. Even those who once defended her began to stay silent. Silence, in politics, is often a sign that support is slipping away. Meanwhile, across Africa and beyond, Traore's name kept rising. Invitations poured in from international conferences, universities, and youth forums. Leaders from different regions wanted to meet him, to hear his vision, to share his energy. Journalists requested interviews, and his words were published in newspapers in multiple languages. He was called the young lion of Africa, the calm captain, and the voice of dignity. In Burkina Faso, the effect was even greater. Young people saw him as proof that age does not limit greatness. They said if a young man could stand on the world stage and face laughter with such strength, then they too could dream bigger. Farmers in villages spoke his name with pride, saying he had shown the world that Burkina Faso was not to be mocked but respected. Even school children repeated his quotes during class, inspired by the way he turned insult into honor. The difference between Omar and Traore became clearer every day. She tried to fight against the tide of criticism, but the more she spoke, the more people remembered her laughter. He, on the other hand, did not need to remind anyone of his dignity, it spoke for itself. He rarely mentioned the incident again, but it followed him like a golden crown, shining brighter each time people replayed the clip. Months later, analysts began to call the event a turning point in modern politics. They said it was an example of how small moments can shape entire careers. A few minutes of laughter had undone years of Omar's efforts. A few minutes of composure had lifted Traore into international respect. Scholars in political science wrote papers about it, calling it the 5-minute lesson in leadership. Professors told their students that this was a clear example of perception, humility, and dignity at work. For Omar, invitations began to decline. Organizations that once called her to speak quietly chose others instead. International groups avoided her, worried that her presence might bring controversy. Even inside her own circle, she felt the distance. The career she had worked so hard to build now felt shaky, not because of laws or policies, but because of one public moment. It was a reminder that trust, once broken, is very difficult to repair. For Traore, the opposite was true. He began to form new alliances. Leaders of other African nations looked at him not as a junior figure but as an equal. Some even asked for his advice, impressed by his ability to handle pressure. His words about independence, resources, and dignity began to echo far beyond Burkina Faso. He had become more than a leader of a small country, he had become a symbol for an entire continent. And yet, through it all, he remained humble. When asked how he felt about being praised so highly, he said the respect was not for him but for his people. He reminded everyone that he stood on the shoulders of those who had struggled before him. He said that if his calmness had inspired others, then it was because the spirit of his nation lived inside him. These words made people admire him even more, because they showed he was not seeking personal glory but genuine respect for his country. The long-term impact was clear. Omar's career never fully recovered. Though she continued working, her influence was reduced. Every new election became harder, every campaign more difficult. The memory of her laughter always returned, used by critics as proof of her weakness. It became the moment that defined her career, overshadowing everything else she had achieved. Traore, however, continued to grow. Each new speech he gave carried extra weight because people remembered how he had handled disrespect before. They knew he would not be easily shaken, and that made his words more powerful. His reputation as a strong yet calm leader opened doors that were once closed to him. He became a voice not only for Burkina Faso but for Africa's new generation of leaders. In the end, the story of those 5 minutes was told in two very different ways. For Omar, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how arrogance, even for a moment, can destroy years of work. For Traore, it was a story of triumph, a reminder of how dignity, even in silence, can raise a person higher than applause. People said the world had learned something that day. They learned that true leadership is not measured by how loud someone can laugh, but by how calmly someone can stand when being laughed at. They learned that respect is not given freely but earned through character. And they learned that once the world sees a person's true nature, no excuse or explanation can change it. As time passed, the clip of Omar laughing and Traore responding calmly continued to circulate. It was played in classrooms, shown in documentaries, and remembered in speeches. It became more than news, it became history. And history, once written, cannot be undone. That was how a short moment changed two lives forever. Ilhan Omar, once seen as a rising figure, carried the weight of her mistake. Ibrahim Traore, once underestimated because of his youth, carried the crown of dignity. The world moved on to other events, but the lesson of that day remained, shining like a beacon: respect lasts longer than laughter, and calmness destroys arrogance more completely than anger ever could.